The distress beacon had been transmitting for 11 hours before anyone answered. Not because the Galactic Coalition was slow, not because the routing algorithms had failed or the signal degraded across the void. The beacon had been received, logged, flagged, and escalated within 4 minutes of transmission. The delay was deliberate. It was political, because the colony on Vareth, 9 sat in a disputed corridor, and sending ships meant choosing a side, and choosing a side meant war, and war meant paperwork, and paperwork meant committee meetings, and committee meetings meant nothing got done before people died. So 11 hours passed. Then the coalition dispatched what they could without technically committing a single reinforcement unit. 1 soldier, technically a gesture, diplomatically deniable, militarily a joke. Except the unit they selected was the only one available on short deployment notice in the entire sector. Her designation in the coalition registry read, *human female. Combat classification, unrestricted. Homeworld, Earth Sol System. Category, Apex Deathworld Fauna, Sapient. * the receiving officer on Vareth. 9. A Drelkai named Supervisor Orith read the incoming manifest 3 times. He was a species that communicated distress through involuntary color shifts in their facial membranes. By the 3rd reading, he had cycled through 4 shades he didn't have names for. 1 soldier, human. * he sent a follow-up transmission to Coalition Command. We requested reinforcements. You sent one. * the reply came back in 40 seconds. We sent what was available. Orith stared at that message for a long time. Outside his window, the first wave of Keth raiders was breaching the outer perimeter fence. Behind him, 43 civilians waited in a bunker that was rated for emergency habitation, not sustained combat engagement. His garrison, 12 soldiers, 2 of whom were currently injured, was spread thin across 3 defensive positions. And somewhere, a shuttle was descending through the cloud cover. 1 human. He had read about humans. Everyone in the coalition had read about humans, the same way everyone reads about things that cannot possibly be real until they're standing in front of you. He knew the statistics. He had seen the documentaries. He had attended the mandatory cultural integration briefing that spent 40 minutes on the subject of Earth and why its inhabitants were classified differently from every other sapient species on the Coalition registry. Knowing something and believing it are different gravitational forces entirely. His comm crackled. This is Staff Sergeant Yoel Moore, Coalition Rapid Deployment. I'm reading your position. I'm reading your enemy count. * pause. The sound of something metallic being checked, locked, readied. * you've got 3 perimeter breaches in the next 7 minutes if nobody moves. I'm moving. Tell your people to hold the east wall, and do not. I need you to understand me. Do not fire in the direction of the noise until I tell you the noise is done. Orith opened his mouth. Closed it. Acknowledged. He said, because there was nothing else to say. The shuttle hit the ground outside at a speed that should have destroyed it. It didn't. She walked out of the dust cloud, carrying enough equipment that 2 of his soldiers would have struggled under the weight, moving at a pace that suggested the weight was irrelevant, and she looked at the perimeter breach to the north with the calm, assessing expression of someone deciding what to eat for lunch. Then, she looked at him. You the supervisor? Yes. Good. She turned back toward the breach. I'm going to need about 20 minutes. After that, we should talk about your perimeter design because whoever built this did not account for a Keth flanking pattern, and I got some notes. She walked into the fire. She walked. Orith stood at his post and did something he had not done since his commission. He prayed. Not to any particular deity, just outward, into the universe, the formless hope that whatever Earth had produced and placed in front of him was enough. It was not a hope he'd expected to have about a single person. It was not a hope he'd expected to be reasonable. 11 hours. 1 soldier. God help them. Or rather, she would. The colony on Vareth, 9 had not been designed to survive anything. That was not a criticism. It was a geological fact embedded in the original survey reports that the Colonial Development Bureau had submitted, approved, and quietly filed into a subcategory labeled Acceptable Risk Margins before issuing the settlement permits. Varith 9 was a temperate world, breathable atmosphere, decent mineral deposits, positioned at the intersection of 3 trade corridors that made it commercially interesting to everyone and strategically valuable to no one, which was the exact sweet spot the Bureau looked for when they needed to demonstrate that the coalition was expanding without expanding into anything that would cause a political incident. The survey had mentioned, briefly, in appendix notation, that the Keth Dominion considered the corridor contested. The Bureau had noted this, filed it, moved on. 43 civilians now crouched in a prefabricated bunker that smelled of recycled air and fierce sweat, listening to the sounds of the outer perimeter being taken apart with industrial efficiency, and the survey report's appendix notation felt less like an administrative footnote and more like an epitaph. Supervisor Orith 7 of the second of the line, Orith, to everyone who did not have 40 minutes to spare, had not slept in 31 hours. His people were not soldiers. They were administrators, logisticians, 2 agricultural engineers, a medical officer who had trained for infection control rather than combat triage, and 12 garrison troops drawn from the Coalition's 3rd-tier deployment pool, which was the pool you drew from when the 1st and 2nd pools were occupied doing something that mattered more. He had done everything correctly. He had followed every protocol. He had filed the distress beacon the moment the Keth Scout ships appeared on long-range sensors, 8 hours before the first shots were fired, because the protocol was clear. Early warning gives command time to respond. Command had taken 11 hours. He stood at his command post, a folding table, 2 monitors, a communication relay that had been receiving interference since the Keth jammed the primary frequencies, and read the reinforcement manifest again because he had convinced himself the first 2 readings had been a translation error. Inbound unit. 1. Asterisk designation. Moore, Yael. Staff Sergeant. Asterisk species. Human. Asterisk homeworld. Earth Sol System. Asterisk classification. Apex Deathworld fauna. Sapient. Asterisk combat rating. Unrestricted. Asterisk specialist designation. Close quarters assault. Fortification breach, extended solo engagement. Asterisk note, standard protocol waiver applies. Unit is authorized to engage without rules of engagement pre-approval in active combat theater. Asterisk 1 soldier. 1. He sent the follow-up. He received a reply. He read the reply. He set the compad down with the careful deliberateness of a man who was choosing, consciously, not to throw it at the wall, because the wall was load-bearing and he needed it. His second-in-command, a young Thessali named Rekko, whose entire body language communicated barely suppressed panic through the rigid locking of his secondary joints, appeared at his shoulder. "Sir, I'm reading the shuttle trajectory. They're coming in. They're coming in very fast." "How fast?" "Fast enough that our automated landing systems flagged it as a potential hostile approach and almost fired on it." Orith absorbed this, but they didn't. "I overrode it, sir, because the registration codes came back Coalition." "But, sir, the approach speed," Rekko stopped. "Start it again." "Sir, if they land at that speed, the shuttle will be destroyed." "I read that the physical tolerances of humans differ from most Coalition species," Orith said. He was quoting the cultural integration briefing from memory, which he had never expected to be relevant field knowledge. "Substantially." Rekko's joints locked tighter. "How substantially?" Orith did not answer, because the answer was in the briefing, and the briefing was a document that required you to read it twice before it stopped seeming like exaggeration. He had read it twice. He was now experiencing the unique cognitive discomfort of information that had been academic becoming information that was, in approximately 90 seconds, going to become physically present in his landing zone. The shuttle hit the ground at a speed that crumpled the landing struts and gouged a furrow through the packed earth deep enough to bury a body in. The hatch opened. She was not what he had pictured. He was not certain what he had pictured. The briefing had images, but images were flat things, measured things, and the reality of a human emotion was not a flat thing. She was not exceptionally large by the standards of species Orith had encountered. She stood shorter than him, shorter than Rekko, shorter than most of the garrison troops. She had the coloring of someone from the warmer latitudes of her world, dark eyes that moved in the continuous scanning pattern the briefing had described as baseline human situational awareness, hair pulled back in a manner that suggested she had done it without looking or caring. She wore armor that was not Coalition standard issue, which the briefing had also predicted because humans modified their equipment so constantly and so extensively that standard issue was a theoretical concept rather than a practical one. She carried more weight than Recco and two of the garrison troops combined. She moved like it wasn't there. She looked at the perimeter. She looked at the sensor readout on the external post. She looked at him. Her face was the particular expression of someone running fast calculations on a problem they've seen before in different shapes. "You the supervisor?" Her voice was even. This was the detail that undid him most later when he was trying to reconstruct what those first moments had felt like. Not the landing, not the weight she carried, the evenness of her voice, the way it carried no performance of urgency, no adrenaline bleed-through, nothing that acknowledged this was a situation in which panic was the correct biological response. She sounded like someone who had arrived for a meeting that was running slightly behind schedule. "I am," he said. "Orith, right? I read your file on the descent." She was already moving, not toward him, but toward the perimeter sensor array, pulling it toward herself and reading the display with the efficiency of someone who had learned to absorb information while in motion because stillness was not always an option. "You've got 3 breach points developing. North wall, northeast corner, and they're working on a supply depot gate on the south side. But that one's slower. They're trying not to damage what's inside, which tells me they want the depot intact, which tells me they plan to hold this position after they take it." She looked up. "Long-term occupation, not a raid." "Yes," Orith said. He had concluded the same thing 3 hours ago, and it had not made him feel better then, and it did not make him feel better now. "Okay." She handed the sensor array back with a precision that suggested she had registered exactly where it had been before she moved it. "Your east wall is your strongest position. Get everyone there you can spare from the other 2. Tell them to hold, conserve ammunition, and do not advance regardless of what they hear. Particularly regardless of what they hear." "What will they hear?" She had already started walking toward the north wall. She paused without turning. "Me," she said, and then she was moving again, and the word she left hanging was doing things to the air that words didn't usually do. Recco appeared at Orith's elbow. He had cycled through 3 colors Orith had never seen on a Thessaly before. "Sir, redeploy to the east wall," Orith said. "Tell everyone. Hold position. Do not fire north." "Sir, one person do it, Recco," he said in the tone that was not a volume increase, but an absolute statement of organizational authority, and Recco moved, because that tone had never in 11 years of service been wrong about anything. Orith turned back to watch her go. She had already cleared the second internal fence. She was approaching the north wall at a pace that was not running exactly, but was not walking either, something efficient and ground-eating that covered distance without announcing itself, and she was pulling equipment from her kit as she moved with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed this 10,000 times in real situations rather than simulations. And she moved into the smoke from the perimeter explosions without slowing, without changing pace, without any external acknowledgement. That the smoke was a thing that happened to contain an active combat engagement on the other side. She went in. The sounds that came out over the next 19 minutes were not the organized sounds of military engagement. They were not the regular percussion of coordinated fire. They were chaotic and asymmetric and moved constantly. The sound of something that refused to stay in one place, refused to be pinned, refused to operate on any tactical script the Keth had prepared for. There were sounds of Keth communication. He could hear fragments of their tactical channel on the broad-spectrum scanner. And what he heard was confusion, the rising frequency of units trying to report contact, and losing contact before the report was complete, the sound of a plan encountering a variable it had not modeled. He heard her voice once, briefly, on the open channel. Not distressed, not elevated, just a flat statement. Asterisk, northeast corner, coming in on your right in 40 seconds. Don't shoot right. His garrison on the northeast corner reported that they had not fired right. They reported this in the voice of people who had heard something come through their position at a speed and a volume that left them with a profound disinclination to get in its way regardless of instructions. At 18 minutes and 40 seconds, the sounds changed. They didn't stop. They reduced, like a storm that had spent most of its energy and was now sorting through the aftermath with the same methodical attention it had brought to the destruction. At 21 minutes, she came back through the north wall perimeter the same way she had left. Not running, moving efficiently, equipment being stowed with the same fluid precision with which it had been deployed. She had blood on her armor. Not hers, as far as he could tell, though she would explain later that the distinction between her blood and not her blood was less clear-cut than it looked because she had sustained 3 impacts that would have ended most species and had processed them as discomfort rather than damage and kept moving, which was, she would say, with the flat effect of someone stating an engineering fact, just what humans did. She walked up to him. She pulled out a water container and drank from it with the focus of someone recalibrating. North wall is clear, she said. Northeast is clear. I redirected the South Depot group. They pulled back when the North engagement started, which was predictable. They don't like engaging on 2 fronts without communication to command, and I jammed their long-range relay about 4 minutes in, so they've been operating blind since then. She tucked the water away. They'll regroup, probably 2 to 3 hours before the next approach. I'd use that time to shore up the east wall, because that's where they'll come next. They'll decide the north approach is too costly and try to find a softer angle. She looked at him with the even, assessing gaze she had arrived with. You want to show me your fortification layout while we've got time? Orth stared at her. He had commanded this post for 3 years. He had been in the Drelkai Administrative Corps for 11. He had a commendation for logistical excellence in the Preth Corridor resupply operation and a second commendation for conflict de-escalation during the Tessian border renegotiation. He was not a person who lost composure. He had built a career on not losing composure. You sustained 3 impacts, he said. 4, actually. I undercounted earlier. She said it the way you'd say, I left my comm in the other room. The 4th was minor. You sustained 4 impacts. The armor absorbed most of it. Most. The rest, she paused. Something that was almost a shrug moved through her shoulders. The rest is what regeneration is for. I'll be fine in a few hours. Right now I'm functional, which is what matters. She looked at him steadily. The fortification layout supervisor. He showed her the fortification layout. She had notes. She had significant notes. She delivered them in the same even voice she used for everything, walking through his defensive positions with the fluid attention of someone reading a language she was fluent in, and every note was precise and actionable and landed with the quiet authority of someone who had learned these lessons somewhere specific, in situations she was not elaborating on, in the compressed past tense that humans apparently stored their worst experiences in and drew from without ceremony. Recco found him 20 minutes later, standing at the east wall monitoring station, watching her redesign his perimeter from the ground up. Sir, Recco said. His joints had unclenched. His coloring had returned to something approaching normal. This was itself information. Recco's nervous system was more honest than most things Orth had access to. Is this going to work? Orth watched her drag a barrier component into a position that 3 of his garrison troops had apparently failed to arrive at as a defensive option despite 3 years of looking at the same wall. She has notes, he said. Sir. She arrived, cleared 3 perimeter breaches in under 20 minutes, sustained damage that would hospitalize most of my garrison, and came back with notes on our fortification design. He paused. I think we may have been thinking about this wrong. Thinking about what wrong, sir? What reinforcement means, Orth said. We were waiting for an army. We got something else. I'm not sure yet if it's better or worse. He watched her work. She moved like the problem was already solved, and she was just explaining the solution to the physical world. Like resistance was a delay rather than an obstacle. Like 21 minutes of active combat engagement against a numerically superior force in poor visibility with no backup was not the kind of thing that was supposed to leave one person standing, and certainly not supposed to leave that one person standing with an opinion about your east wall load-bearing supports. The Keth would come back. She had said 2 to 3 hours. He had 2 to 3 hours to decide what he believed was possible. He looked at the sensor readout. He looked at the east wall. He looked at her, wrestling a structural support into a position it had not been designed for, and making it work through a combination of applied force and engineering pragmatism. He picked up his comm. He had one more follow-up transmission to send a coalition command. It read, "Reinforcement has arrived. Requesting no further units. Current asset appears sufficient. Will advise." He sent it before he fully believed it. He was beginning to, though. That was the thing about humans, he thought. The briefing warned you. The briefing said all of these things, laid them out in clinical language with supporting data and historical precedent. And still, when you're standing in front of one, watching one function at a level that rewrote everything you thought you understood about what a single organism could do in a defined space against a defined threat, the intellectual preparation did not close the gap between knowing and understanding. Understanding came from watching, from standing at a monitoring station in the ruins of a night that should have ended differently, listening to her voice delivering calm, specific instructions to his garrison about load distribution and field of fire angles, and feeling for the first time since the Keth had appeared on the long-range sensors, something that was not quite hope yet, but was standing in hope's general neighborhood. She looked up from the structural support, caught him watching, did not perform self-consciousness about it. "Get some sleep if you can," she said. 2 hours. "I'll take watch." "You've been in active engagement for I'll take watch," she said again. The same tone. The tone that was not a command, exactly, but was a statement of intent that had already accounted for all the counterarguments and was simply waiting for agreement to catch up to it. He slept. For the first time in 31 hours, Supervisor Orith 7 of the 2nd Drelka line closed his eyes because something outside himself had become, without ceremony or announcement, the most capable thing in the room. He slept, and she watched, and the perimeter held. And in 2 hours and 40 minutes, the Keth came back. She was ready. She had been ready since she landed. That was the last thing he was still learning to understand about her. That the readiness was not performance, not bravado, not the constructed confidence of someone who needed to project capability. It was just her baseline state, the thing she operated from without effort, the way everyone else operated from rest. Ready was how she rested. He woke to the sound of the perimeter sensors triggering and her voice on the comm, steady and even and already in motion. "East wall. Just like I said. Here we go." The Keth did not return the same way twice. That was the detail that distinguished them from the lower-tier raiding groups that occasionally tested coalition border settlements. The ones who ran the same approach vector on repeat until they succeeded or retreated, whose tactical creativity ended to try again harder. The Keth studied. They adapted. They spent the 2-hour window not regrouping in the sense of recovering losses, but regrouping in the sense of rebuilding their understanding of what had happened to their North Wall approach and engineering a response to it. This was, she had explained to him before he slept, exactly what she was counting on. He had not understood that yet. He understood it now, standing at the east wall monitoring station as the sensor array lit up with contact signatures. Watching her move to the position she had spent the last 2 hours preparing and feeling the pieces arrange themselves into something coherent. She had not fortified the east wall the way a defensive commander would fortify a wall. She had fortified it the way a person who wanted something to happen in a specific place would fortify the other places to make that place look like the path of least resistance. The north wall, which she had cleared, she had made look worse after clearing it. Not destroyed, damaged. Patchwork. The kind of thing that suggested the defenders had tried to repair it and done a mediocre job. The kind of thing that suggested the north wall was being held by garrison troops without specialist support. The kind of thing that if you were a Keth tactical planner reviewing your sensor data after a setback, you would note as the location of the original breach point and the location of whatever had destroyed your first approach wave, and you would make a reasonable decision to find a different angle. The east wall looked like the obvious next choice. She had made it look that way. He had asked her 2 hours ago, while she was still working, why she was making the east wall's outer approach look more accessible than it was. She had explained it in the calm, patient voice of someone who had learned to translate intuitive tactical understanding into language that non-humans could follow without making the translation feel like condescension. The Keth, she said, were smart. You could not beat smart opponents by being strong. You beat them by being predictable enough that they predicted wrong. Give them a conclusion to reach, she said. Make the evidence point to it. Then, be waiting at the conclusion. The east wall's outer approach looked accessible. The inner approach was the most comprehensively prepared kill zone she had been able to construct with 2 hours and the materials available in a frontier colonial settlement that had not been designed for sustained combat, which was a constraint she had worked around with the cheerful pragmatism of someone who considered constraints to be engineering problems rather than limitations. Rekko had helped her. He had started helping because she had asked in a way that did not invite refusal, and he had kept helping because, he told Orth later, during the debrief, still in the faintly dazed state that seemed to be standard for everyone who spent extended time in her operational radius, because watching her think was the most interesting thing he had ever done professionally, and also because she explained everything as she did it, not for any pedagogical reason, but simply because talking through her process seemed to be how her mind organized it, and the explanations were the kind that made you feel smarter for having heard them, which was its own form of unusual. The Keth came through the east wall's outer approach with coordinated efficiency. They stacked in units. They used their standard breach protocol, which was effective against fixed defensive positions staffed by species whose combat reflexes operated in a standard range. They communicated in compressed tactical bursts that his broad-spectrum scanner could read, but not decrypt. They moved in good formation, and they moved fast, and they clearly believed that the primary threat was already neutralized, that whatever had destroyed the North Wall approach was the anomaly, and they had adapted to it, and what remained was the routine completion of an occupation operation that was now running behind schedule, but was still fundamentally on track. They were not wrong to believe this. They were wrong about which part was the anomaly. She hit the lead unit from a position that should not have allowed for a firing angle, because the position had not offered a firing angle until she had spent 40 minutes quietly restructuring the material around it. The lead unit went down before the second unit had completed their breach entry, which was the kind of timing that required either an automated system or a human, and the Keth, who knew about humans, who had their own cultural briefings and their own intelligence files on apex Deathworlder species, had known intellectually that there was a human in this settlement. Knowing and believing again. The gap was the same in every species. The second unit attempted to redirect. She had anticipated the redirect. She was already somewhere else, moving through a channel she had cleared specifically for this, and the second unit's redirect brought them into the line of fire of the garrison troops on the north-facing east wall position, which was the position she had told Ortha's garrison to hold regardless of what they heard. And they had held it, and now they had a target, which was the first time in this engagement that his garrison had been in a position to be effective rather than just surviving. She had given him a moment. He watched on the sensor array as the engagement moved through the position she had set up, and it was like watching a mind made external. The tactical structure she had built in 2 hours, running its sequence with the efficiency of something much longer planned, each position triggering the next. Each redirect she forced becoming the enemy's approach to the subsequent position, and all of it moving toward the eastern staging area where she had spent the last 40 minutes of her preparation doing something with the supply depot inventory that she had not fully explained, and that Orith, reviewing the sensor readout, was beginning to understand. The staging area was not, as the Keth had identified it, the defensible interior position. It was the end of the sequence. The Keth tactical commander, he could identify the command signature on the scanner. The unit that was broadcasting coordination rather than engagement responses redirected to the staging area with the decisive authority of a commander who believed they had identified the defensive fallback point and was moving to seal it. She let them get inside. The sound that followed was comprehensive. When it was done, the broad-spectrum scanner was reading no active Keth signals in the settlement perimeter. One signal at extreme range, the staging vessel pulling back. Not retreating in the disorganized sense. Repositioning. They would report to their command. Their command would make decisions. Those decisions would take time, because the decisions required understanding what had happened, and what had happened was not something that fit cleanly into existing Keth tactical doctrine. She came back through the east wall with a different quality of blood on her armor than before. He was beginning to understand that this was how you read her physical state, since she did not communicate it directly. The amount and distribution of blood on her armor was an external record of what had happened in there, and this record indicated that this engagement had asked more of her than the first one. She was moving with the same efficiency, but the efficiency was doing more work. She was compensating for something, the microscopic adjustments of a body managing pain as a logistics problem rather than an experience. She sat down on a supply crate. This was new. She had not sat down before. "You're injured," he said. "Manageable." She pulled her armor panel and looked at something on her left side with the detached assessment of a mechanic checking a component. 2 ribs. They'll knit. Humans do that. She replaced the panel. "You have a medical officer?" "She's not trained for, I don't need surgery. I need wrapping and about 4 hours of sleep, in that order." She looked up. "After we talk about the staging vessel." He had seen the repositioning. He had been hoping she had not, which was not a realistic hope given that she had been in the middle of the engagement and was still processing tactical data before she had finished breathing. He pulled up the sensor readout. He showed her the trajectory. She looked at it for a long moment. The kind of long moment that was actually short but felt long because something was happening in it that he did not have access to. "They're going to come back with more," she said. "That's the Keth doctrine on failed occupation attempts. They don't abandon the objective, they escalate the resource commitment." She tilted her head at the screen. "That vessel is a tactical relay. It's sending the engagement record to a command ship. Command ship is going to review it and decide this settlement requires a different classification of response." "How long?" "Keth logistics are efficient. 6 hours. Maybe 8. She looked at him. "I can't do this alone against a command class engagement. I want you to understand that clearly. I'm not going to tell you it's fine. It's not fine. We need to talk about evacuation routes." He had not expected this. He had begun, in the past 2 hours, to construct a version of reality in which she was the variable that made the math work out regardless of the inputs. It was not a reasonable version of reality, and he had known it was not reasonable, but it had been constructive in the way that certain unreasonable things are constructive because the alternative is despair, and despair is an option that costs everything. She was watching him process this. "The math is the math," she said, not unkindly. The evenness of her voice had a different quality when it was delivering something difficult. Not softened, not performed, but carrying an acknowledgement that the information was hard even while the delivery was level. "I told you before, in the briefing documents, humans don't win by being invincible. We win by being stubborn and smart and making the other side pay a price they didn't budget for. We made them pay that price twice now. They're going to revise the budget. So we evacuate. We plan for evacuation. There's a difference." She stood up. The motion cost her something, a compression in her jaw that she moved through rather than stopping for. "We plan for evacuation, and we plan for the possibility that we don't need to evacuate because a command class response also involves communication, and communication means someone is going to hear what happened here twice in the same night from a Keth relay vessel that had not planned to be sending retreat data. And that's the kind of information that moves." He was slow to follow this. He had been awake for most of the past 30-some hours, and his cognition was functioning in the reduced mode of a system running on emergency power. She saw him processing. She waited. "Coalition Command," he said, "and others. There are parties with interest in this corridor who are not Coalition, who are not Keth, who watch Keth relay traffic the way a lot of people watch things that other people don't want them watching. She picked up her water container again. A Keth command vessel repositioning to suppress a frontier settlement is navigational intelligence. If someone is tracking that vessel's movement, they're going to have questions. And questions mean attention. And attention changes the political calculation, he said. The Bureau filed this settlement in the acceptable risk margin category, she said. She had clearly read the same documents he had. She said the category name with a dryness that was not quite contempt and not quite humor, but lived in the narrow space between them. Risk margins stop being acceptable when they're generating command class Keth responses and interstellar incident reports. Someone, somewhere in the coalition's administrative structure, is going to have a very bad morning when they understand what this settlement's political footprint has become overnight. Orth sat down on the crate across from her. His legs had made a unilateral decision. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that the goal is not to hold the settlement until reinforcements arrive. The goal is to make holding the settlement complicated enough for the Keth that reinforcements become a political necessity rather than an administrative courtesy," she said. "Which we've done. Twice. Which the staging vessel is currently transmitting in compressed format to a command ship. Which the command ship's repositioning will broadcast to everyone watching Keth military navigation in this sector." She paused. "The reinforcements were always going to be the political kind. I was just the physical time buffer until the political kind showed up." He stared at her. "You knew this coming in." "I read the situation on the descent," she said. It was neither confirmation nor denial. It was the answer of someone who had considered the information available, reached a conclusion, and declined to state whether the conclusion had preceded or followed the arrival. "What matters is what we do in the next 6 to 8 hours." "What do we do in the next 6 to 8 hours?" "You get the medical officer to wrap my ribs. I sleep for 4 hours. You prep the evacuation route as a contingency. And then we talk to your garrison about what the next engagement is going to look like, because the first 2 times they mostly watched, and the 3rd time they're going to need to be part of it." She tilted her chin toward the east wall. "Recco's good. The others need to be told that they're good. They don't know it yet. They're 3rd-tier garrison troops. They held every position I asked them to hold under conditions that would have broken better trained units. They held it because they trusted the structure, and because Recco talked to them in the gaps, and because humans on the other side of their perimeter were making enough noise that it was very clear what not holding would mean." She looked at him with the level, even gaze that did its own kind of work. "3rd tier is a classification. It doesn't tell you anything about what a person is capable of when the structure they're operating inside is right." He thought about 3 years of this posting, about filing reports in the category of acceptable risk margin and telling himself the classification was accurate. He thought about a 2-hour window being used to turn a defensive liability into a strategic asset by one person with a clear head and the willingness to treat every available variable as a resource rather than a constraint. "You keep doing that," he said. "What?" "Recontextualizing." He looked for the word and found it. "Everything you look at, the wall layout, the garrison, the Keth retreat, you look at it and arrive at a meaning for it that is not the one I had." She considered this. "The meaning you have for a thing is usually the one you arrived at first," she said. "First isn't always wrong, but it calcifies. New information stops changing it because you've already decided what it is." She stood up again, moved toward the perimeter with the efficiency that was her resting state. "Earth is a bad place to calcify. Things come at you from too many angles. A death world teaches you not to have fixed conclusions," he said. She glanced back. Something in her face that was almost an expression. "It teaches you not to have conclusions you can't revise fast enough to survive the revision." She went to find the medical officer. He sat on the supply crate for a moment longer. Outside, the settlement perimeter was quiet, the managed provisional quiet of a battlefield between rounds rather than the genuine quiet of a concluded event. His garrison was at their positions. Recco was running communications checks with the disciplined efficiency of someone who had found in the past 4 hours a new understanding of what efficiency looked like when it was actually functioning. 43 civilians in the bunker. 12 garrison troops, 2 of them still injured. 1 human, currently getting her ribs wrapped by a medical officer who had trained for infection control, and was now discovering that the physical tolerances of the patient she was treating required a significant revision of her working assumptions. 6 to 8 hours. He pulled up the evacuation route maps and began making them real. Not because he believed they would need them, but because she had said there was a difference between planning for evacuation and evacuating, and he was beginning to understand that the difference lived in the territory between expecting to fail and being ready for the possibility of it. He planned. He organized. He walked the garrison posts and said things to his troops that he had not previously said about what they had done in the past 4 hours and what it meant, and the saying of it changed something in the air of each position he visited, something that had the quality of a resource that had been there all along and had just needed identifying. At the medical bay, he heard the officer's voice through the partition, steady, professional, administering care to someone who was describing their own injury status in the calm tone of a diagnostic readout. And somewhere in the dark between stars, a Keth relay vessel was transmitting data that was already changing the shape of a political calculation that had consigned 43 people and 12 garrison troops to a line in a risk margin category. The political reinforcements were coming. But for 6 to 8 more hours, the physical kind, the one with 2 cracked ribs and a clear head and the infuriating habit of arriving at meetings faster than everyone else, was what they had. He walked back to his command post. He sat down. He began to prepare. She slept like a machine shutting down for maintenance, completely without transition in the 4 hours she had allocated for it, and not a minute more. He knew this because he had checked at the 2-hour mark, and found her on the supply room floor with the settled stillness of something that had decided to be unconscious and done it properly. And at the 4-hour mark, she was already awake when Rekko went to tell her, sitting with her back to the wall and her eyes open and her water container in her hand, looking at the middle distance with an expression that suggested the thinking had already resumed before the sleeping was fully finished. She did not ask how long she had slept. She already knew. He did not understand how. It would be, she explained later when he asked, an internal calibration. Humans had a well-developed sense of elapsed time when sleeping, a holdover from environments where waking at the wrong moment was its own category of terminal outcome. She said terminal outcome the way a textbook said it, which was not the way a person usually described something that meant you would die, but she was a person who had clearly decided a long time ago that the cleaner words served better. The 6-hour window came. The Keth came with it. This time they were not subtle. Subtlety had been the approach of an occupation force that wanted the settlement intact. The command vessel's revised assessment had apparently concluded that the settlement's value as an intact holding was now secondary to the value of eliminating the variable that had destroyed 2 of their approach waves, because the command vessel sent what it sent with the unmistakable force signature of a suppression operation rather than an occupation one. Orth read the sensors. He read them again. 3 drop units, he said. Not to anyone in particular. To the air. To the general concept of the universe, which had decided to be adversarial this week. 3. She was at his shoulder, having appeared without announcement in the way she moved when she was in operational mode. Not quietly as a deliberate tactic, just efficiently, because efficiency for her had no wasted motion and no wasted sound. She looked at the readout, plus the command vessel maintaining position at the edge of the engagement radius. She traced the formation on the sensor display. They're not trying to take the settlement anymore. They're trying to sterilize the threat. The threat being you. Mostly, she did not flinch from this. I've done enough damage to 2 approach waves that their tactical analysis has flagged me as the operational variable, which is actually useful. He looked at her. How was that useful? Because 3 drop units deployed against a single target is a significant resource commitment. Resources they're not deploying against your people, against the structure, against the civilians. She straightened up from the sensor display. They want me specifically, so we give them me specifically. He knew what she was saying. He knew before she said it. And he did not like knowing it before she said it, because the knowing made the saying arrive with a weight that went somewhere he didn't have a word for. You're talking about drawing them, he said. Drawing them toward the north approach. The approach they know has cost them twice, which means they'll expect it to cost them again, which means they'll come heavy and prepared, which means they'll come in a formation that I can't break by myself. She looked at him, the level gaze that did its own kind of work. But their formation will leave the east, and south approaches lighter. And your garrison, my garrison is not trained for this kind of engagement. Your garrison, she said, has held every position I gave them for 6 hours against a force that should have taken this settlement before I landed. They've held it because they know their positions, they know their fields of fire, and because Rekko has been talking to them in every gap. She paused. They're not going to fight the way I fight. They don't need to. They need to hold the east approach long enough for me to finish the north and redirect. 20 minutes. Maybe less. Maybe more. Maybe more, she said. She was not going to lie to him. She had not lied to him once since she landed, which was the thing about her that he had relied on most heavily and been most aware of relying on. The way you're aware of the floor when you've been standing on it long enough to notice that not everything is this solid. It's a risk. I won't pretend it isn't. But the alternative is falling back to the bunker and waiting for the command vessel to escalate further, and every escalation narrows the window before we're past what evacuation can solve. He looked at the sensor readout. He looked at the drop unit trajectories. He looked at the formation, at the command vessel sitting at the engagement edge, at the math of a suppression operation versus the math of a frontier settlement and its people. He thought about acceptable risk margin. He thought about a bureau filing a category 43 people in a bunker. Brief the garrison, he said. She moved. He watched her walk the positions in 11 minutes before the drop units achieved engagement range. And what she did at each position was not a speech and not a pep talk and not any of the forms of motivation he had encountered in leadership documentation. It was simpler than that. She went to each position and she told them exactly what was going to happen, exactly what she needed from them, exactly how long she needed it, and exactly why it would work. Not whether it would work, why it would. There was a difference. He had been learning to see the differences she made between things that looked similar. At the northeast corner, where a garrison soldier named Veth, young, had joined the colonial posting 2 months ago, had spent the past 6 hours in a state of managed terror that Orith had noted and not known how to address, stood at his post with the rigid posture of someone holding themselves together by organizational structure alone. She stopped. She looked at him, not at the perimeter, at him. What's your name? Vit Mong. Veth of the Veth, she said. You've been on this corner for 6 hours. You've had contact on 2 sides of your position. You held. She paused. I need you on this corner for 20 more minutes. You've already done the harder part. Veth looked at her. He did not say anything. Whatever reorganization happened in him in those few seconds did not require words. It was the kind of reorganization that happens when a specific, true thing arrives at the right moment and does more structural work than an hour of support or an hour of leadership documentation or anything organizational. He nodded. She moved on. The drop units hit atmosphere. The north approach, which she had left looking damaged and patchwork and defended by garrison troops without specialist support, received the heaviest of the 3 drop units. This was the correct decision from their tactical perspective. This was the predictable decision. This was the decision she had designed the past 2 hours to make predictable. She went north. He tracked her on the sensor readout from the command station. He had been tracking her through every engagement, and he had never entirely gotten used to the way the sensor data read when she was in a space, the way contact signatures flickered and destabilized around her position, the way the Keth communication traffic spiked and broke into the fragmented pattern that meant coordination was failing, the way the signature of forward momentum went from organized to chaotic in intervals that were shorter than they should have been for a single unit. Against a drop force. She had told him something on the descent that he was remembering now, in the context of watching the sensor readout do the thing it was doing. She had said that the reason single human engagements against numerically superior forces were not suicide missions was not because humans were physically invincible. It was because humans evolved in an environment that required constant environmental processing, operated at a sensory and decision-making speed that most species had not evolved for and had not trained against. The Keth had trained against a lot of things. They had not trained against something that processed their formation movements and found the gaps in them faster than the formation could close, that moved between contact points with the fluency of something that had learned environmental navigation in a context where the environment was actively trying to kill you at every scale from microscopic to macro. The North engagement was loud, complex. The sensor data was nearly unreadable from the volume of contact events. The East approach was quieter, and then it wasn't. The East drop unit, lighter than the North force, but larger than anything his garrison had faced alone, came through the approach he had structured and found 12 troops, some of them 2 months out of training, some of them 2 years into a comfortable administrative posting, one of them with a knee injury that had not fully healed, and one of them running her first active engagement at a post she had believed was safe enough to take, in prepared positions with clear fields of fire, and the specific knowledge of exactly what she needed from them and exactly why. Rekko was on the comm, coordinating between positions, his voice steady in the particular way of someone who has decided that steadiness is the thing the moment needs and has decided to supply it regardless of what the rest of him is feeling. Veth held his corner. He held it for 23 minutes, which was 3 more minutes than she had said and 3 more minutes than Orith had thought was possible when he watched the East drop unit's entry formation on the sensor display. He held it while the engagement moved through the positions on either side of him, and while the comm traffic compressed into the shorthand of people under stress, and while the contact signatures on the sensor readout did the flickering, chaotic thing that meant she was in the East now too, that the North was done, and she was redirecting, and the North being done in the time frame it was done and was a number that Orith looked at on the sensor record and quietly did not know what to do with. At 23 minutes, the East engagement was over. She came back through the East wall. She sat down immediately, which was not a thing she had done after the first 2 engagements without several minutes of post-engagement function first. And this time the blood on her armor was enough that he said nothing and simply went to find the medical officer. "The command vessel is still positioned," she said from the supply crate. Her voice was even. The evenness was working harder than it had been. "I see it. They're not advancing." A pause. "They're receiving a communication." He looked at the sensor readout. She was right. The command vessel had gone still at the engagement edge, which was not the behavior of a vessel preparing to escalate, and was not the behavior of a vessel preparing to withdraw. It was the behavior of a vessel receiving information that required a decision. He stood very still. He watched the readout. The medical officer arrived, and he did not look away from the sensor display while she began working. "There," she said. The command vessel's signature changed. Navigational adjustment. Not an advance vector. Not a withdrawal vector. Not in the direction it had arrived from. A lateral repositioning, the kind that meant creating distance from a specific location while maintaining observation of it. She made a sound that he would have called relief in anyone else, but was coming from her, more like satisfaction, the confirmation of a calculation rather than the release of a held breath. "Someone is asking them questions they don't want to answer on an open channel," she said. "Someone with the authority to make that question uncomfortable." She looked at him across the medical bay's makeshift space. Someone noticed the relayed data. He looked at the command vessel's repositioning vector. He looked at the communication traffic analysis, which his scanner was flagging in the category of high-priority encrypted cross-faction exchange, which was the designation that appeared when 2 significant entities were talking on a channel that both of them wanted kept private, and neither of them was succeeding. "Coalition," he said. "Coalition is one of the parties." She winced, not from the medical attention, or not only from that. The other signal origin is in the re-thick configuration, which means the neutral observers in the corridor are asking the Keth why a command vessel is deployed against a coalition frontier settlement at exactly the political moment when the re-thick compact is trying to negotiate corridor access rights with both parties. He processed this. "The timing," he started, "is not accidental," she said. "The re-thick have been watching this corridor for 8 months. They've been watching Keth military positioning. They've been watching the Coalition's response to Keth positioning, which has mostly been the administrative kind. Her jaw compressed briefly. A command vessel deploying against a settlement in the corridor gives the Re-Thick a direct data point on Keth territorial behavior. That data point is worth something to them in the negotiation. They're not going to let the Keth bury it quietly. She looked at him. The political reinforcements, he said, are here, she said, not on our doorstep. In the communication traffic of a command vessel that cannot now withdraw quietly without answering for why it was here, and cannot advance further without creating exactly the kind of incident that the Keth Dominion's diplomatic apparatus has been very carefully avoiding in front of the Re-Thick for 8 months. A pause. They're stuck. He sat down. He sat down with the full weight of 30-something hours of no sleep and 6 hours of active combat engagement, and the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent the entire duration of a crisis holding a structure together by will and organizational habit, while also processing a continuous series of recontextualizations that fundamentally changed what the structure was holding together for. The command vessel was receiving communications it could not dismiss. His garrison was still at their posts, some of them running on the bare mechanical operation of training and position and the instruction not to stand down until told, and Rekko was on the comm checking positions in order, methodical, the way he did everything. And at the northeast corner, Veth was reporting his status in the steady voice of someone who had been on that corner for 6 hours and would be on it for as long as was needed, because somewhere in the 23rd minute of an engagement he had not been trained for, he had understood something about himself that the administrative classification system did not have a field for. She let the medical officer finish. She stood up, with the careful precision of someone managing her available physical capacity with full awareness of its current limits. She walked to the perimeter. She looked at the command vessel's position on the sensor display. How long until they withdraw? He asked. Depends on how the communication resolves. She looked at the display with the particular attention of someone reading a language in real time. The Re-Thick negotiator will want a formal acknowledgement. The Keth command will want to phrase it in the most ambiguous terms possible. That's a conversation that takes hours. A pause. Productive hours for us. Coalition Command will send real reinforcements now, he said. Not a question. He was tracing the logic she had laid out over the course of the night, and arriving at the end of it. Coalition Command will send real reinforcements because the political cost of not sending them is now higher than the political cost of choosing a side in the corridor dispute, she said. Which is what a command-class Keth deployment against a coalition settlement does to the calculation. Which is why, she stopped. He waited. Which is why, she said, more quietly, the Bureau's risk margin classification was wrong. Not because the settlement was safe. It wasn't safe. It's right here in the wreckage. She did not gesture at the perimeter. She did not need to. The night had made its point comprehensively. It was wrong because they calculated acceptable risk as a fixed value. Static. Risk isn't static. Every hour a settlement exists in a contested corridor, it accumulates weight. Political weight. Economic weight. Attention from parties with interest in what happens to it. The Keth knew this. They timed an occupation attempt at a window when that weight was low. She paused. They miscalculated how fast the weight accumulates when something in the corridor resists. She looked at him. We changed the weight, he said. You changed the weight, she said. You and your garrison and Rekko running comm for 6 hours and Veth on his corner. And the 43 people in the bunker who stayed in the bunker and didn't break the seal and didn't generate an evacuation scenario that would have overwhelmed the garrison. A pause. I was the time buffer. I told you that. He looked at her for a long moment. She was doing the thing she did where her face was not expressionless, but was economical. The expression was there, but compressed, deployed at the minimum viable scale, which he had come to understand was not distance, but efficiency, the same efficiency that governed every other aspect of how she operated. Staff Sergeant, he said, what will you write in your engagement report? She looked at the command vessel's position on the sensor display. That the garrison of Verith 9 held an occupied settlement against 2 conventional approach waves and one command-class suppression deployment over a 6-hour period, and maintained civilian safety throughout. She paused. That the settlement's defensive performance was sufficient to create a political incident that has triggered cross-faction diplomatic communication and is currently constraining Keth command vessel positioning in the corridor. And your role? Specialist support, she said. She said it with the particular dryness that lived between contempt and humor and occupied neither. He thought about what specialist support had looked like from the command station. He thought about the things the engagement record contained, the sensor data, the comm traffic, the timestamps of engagements that had not lasted as long as they should have lasted and had not cost what they should have cost. He thought about the brief, precise things she had said at each garrison position 11 minutes before the last engagement, and about a 23-minute corner hold by a soldier 2 months into his first posting, and about what the word support usually meant and what it meant when she said it. He said nothing because there was nothing to say that the record did not already say better. The communication between the Rethik negotiator and the Keth command vessel continued in the encrypted frequencies. The command vessel did not advance. The morning light of Varith 9 star came up over the eastern perimeter with the ordinary, unconcerned beauty of a star that had been rising over this planet for longer than the settlement had existed, and would continue to do so for longer than the political dispute would, and the perimeter held, and the garrison held, and in the bunker 43 people were still alive and intact, and would be informed in a few hours that the situation had resolved, and they could come out, and they would come out, and the settlement would still be standing. She sat down on the supply crate again, pulled out her water container, drank. Coalition Command's advanced vessel should be at the corridor entry point in 4 hours, she said. Probably 2 ships. Political presence rather than combat deployment. They'll want to be visible to the Rethik as responding to the situation rather than instigating it. They'll want a briefing, he said. They'll want a briefing that makes it very clear the settlement held under its own resources for the critical window, because that's the narrative that supports their corridor position most effectively. She looked at him. Your report should lead with that. The garrison performance. The civilian security. The duration. A pause. Lead with what held, not with what was at risk. He thought about 3 years of administrative reports, about language chosen to minimize concern, to present the post in the most favorable category, to avoid drawing attention to risk margins that had been accepted as acceptable. He thought about the difference between that kind of report and the kind she was describing. He thought about what it meant to lead with what held. I'll write it that way, he said. She nodded, just once. The nod of someone who had expected this answer and found it satisfactory. Outside, Rekko was making his morning position check in the orderly, methodical way he did everything, and the voices that came back on the comm were tired and intact and present, and the word present was doing more work than it usually did, being something that had not been guaranteed 12 hours ago, and now was, and that was the difference between a number in a risk margin category and a thing that had actually happened in the world. She finished her water. She set the container down. 4 hours, she said. You should sleep. I should. The command vessel is waiting for political resolution. Your garrison is at their posts, and Rekko has them. The civilians are secure. She looked at him with the even, patient gaze that had been doing structural work since she landed. You've been awake for 37 hours. The decision-making capacity of a sleep-deprived administrator is the lowest quality resource you have right now. A pause. Sleep. He looked at the perimeter. He looked at the sensor display. He looked at her, sitting on the supply crate with 2 cracked ribs and a night's worth of engagement record on her armor, looking back at him with the fundamental steadiness of something that did not require his presence to continue being steady. If something changes, I'll wake you. He believed her. He believed her the way he had believed her about the East Wall and the political calculation and the 2 to 3 hour window between the first and second engagements. He believed her the way you believe things that have been consistently and precisely true in conditions that stripped away every reason for trust that wasn't structural. He slept. He woke to Rekko's voice, not hers, reporting that 2 coalition vessels had entered sensor range, and were broadcasting standard approach credentials. He woke to the ordinary sounds of a settlement morning. Equipment checks, position reports, the distant, unremarkable sounds of 43 civilians being told the bunker seal was releasing. He woke to the sensor display, showing a Keth command vessel that had begun a withdrawal vector sometime in the last hour, executing the kind of measured, deliberate repositioning that was designed to communicate discipline rather than retreat, and communicating retreat anyway. She was at the perimeter. She was looking at the withdrawal vector on the display panel in the particular way. She looked at things that had gone as predicted. Not satisfaction exactly, something more functional than satisfaction, the assessment of a confirmed calculation folding into the baseline, and the attention already moving forward. The Coalition advance vessel's comm came through with the crisp formality of a political envoy trying to reframe the night as an authorized response rather than an 11-hour administrative delay. She let him take the comm. She stepped back and let him take the briefing and the credit and the narrative management because she had said lead with what held, and what had held was his settlement and his garrison and his people, and she was the specialist support, which was a category she had chosen for herself in the report with the deliberateness of someone choosing where a thing belonged. Later, after the envoy had departed and the garrison had stood down and the civilians had come out blinking into the morning and found their settlement standing around them in the form of a thing that had been defended or had found her at the landing zone. She was looking at her shuttle, the shuttle that had hit the ground at a speed that should have destroyed it and hadn't. She was looking at it with the critical eye of an engineer assessing damage. "Will it fly?" he said. "It'll fly," she said. "It'll need work when I get back, but it'll fly." She looked at him. New assignment came in during the comm clearance. There's a colony outpost in the Delis Reach that's been broadcasting intermittent distress signals. Command classified it non-priority. He looked at her. "One soldier," he said. The expression that was almost an expression moved through her face. "One soldier," she said. He thought about what one soldier looked like when it was the right kind of one soldier. He thought about a sensor readout, doing things that sensor readouts were not supposed to do. He thought about what the word reinforcement usually meant and what it had turned out to mean when it arrived in the form of a shuttle hitting the ground at a speed that should have been the end of the story and was instead the beginning of it. He thought about the report he was going to file. Not in the acceptable risk margin category. Not in the language of things minimized to avoid administrative attention. In the language of what it held and why and what it had cost and what it was worth. "Safe travel, Staff Sergeant," he said. She nodded. The nod of someone receiving a thing, simply. She got into the shuttle. The hatch closed. The engines came up. She was gone before the Coalition envoy's vessel had finished its departure sequence, moving through the atmosphere on a trajectory that the automated landing systems would flag as an aggressive ascent angle, moving toward a settlement in the Delis Reach that had been classified non-priority, moving toward whatever the next 11 hours would look like. One soldier. The word reinforcement had always meant, in every language and every filing system, more than you have. It had meant volume. Numbers. The accumulated weight of additional bodies in the equation. It had meant armies, fleets, political commitments, the industrial machinery of support. He stood at the landing zone and watched the shuttle trace its line into the sky. He thought about what the word meant now. More than you have. That was still right. That was still exactly right. She was in the most specific and structural sense of the word, more than anyone had. He walked back to his command post. He sat down. He opened a new report. He wrote, "The settlement held." He kept writing.